So cool. Quick announcements, I guess. Starting to think about next reading group. So we're going to be doing Whitehead's Religion in the Making. I'll figure out soon a specific syllabus with dates and stuff once I get my hands on the actual text. Feel free to just shoot me a message or tell me in the call if you're for sure interested in coming along, and I can get you down. I said in my post there would be a $15 registration fee. I am mostly doing that just for people who. So whenever I do this, I get a lot of people who are interested and send me a message that they want to come along, and then they are not really along. And so I'm just trying to kind of put a bit of a barrier there for entry and help people stay committed and make a little pocket cash off those people who aren't committed. So I would be fine in letting you all on free of charge since I know you are committed. So just a quick announcement about that. Otherwise, yeah, we got one chapter left of Nishitani after this discussion. So we're getting towards the end. Less than a month left, and 4 discussions, counting this one. So exciting stuff. I just emailed Professor Brett Davis today to see if he'd be available for a Q&A debrief once we're done. So that would be awesome if we're able to get that scheduled, but we'll see what he says. So yeah, I'll keep you updated. All right, that's all I had to say for today. Any chit chat you want to get out of the way before we dive in here? All right, sounds like we're raring to go. So I will get us started here, and we can again continue to sort of collaborate on a summary, as that seems to be working well. I want to try to stay a bit more grounded in the text this time. We've been particularly tangential as of late, which is fun, but I want to make sure we don't miss over anything important in our primary source here. So we got 3 sections in Śūnyatā and Time that we read for today, starting out with section 5 on page 193. And this was a pretty action-packed bit before he transitioned to a very different sort of line of discussion in the next 2 sections. Anyone want to give a stab at what he's doing in this section 5 here? I have a couple passages I want to pull out and discuss that can help us zone in on the important points here. But if anyone wants to start off with a quick overview, that'd be great. Any takers?
I had a couple specific passages as well, but I don't remember like an overview necessarily.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like this section to me feels kind of like the culmination of the previous sections that we'd read for last week. I think he really kind of ties things together here, where it wasn't entirely clear what he was building to in those previous sections where we left off. So sure, I'll give it a stab here. So we're back to talking about logos.
Yeah, okay. I mean, if you want to try and give it a linear overview first, that's great. I feel like it would be helpful for me to start with like, what are the terms that he's bringing in this section, and how do they relate to his argument? So he's talking about the logos for sure. He's talking about what is it? Body and mind dropping off, right? He's talking about logos and its connection with koto. What else do we got as far as idea? Oh, he talks about Toynbee's narrative about progress in history.
Yeah, that starts in section 6 and 7.
Okay, just in 5 then. Does anyone have any other concepts or ideas that we bring to bear in page 5?
I think the other really important ones here are existens. A really consistently important one that is hard to pin down. And then perhaps one that he doesn't use so often here, but is pretty key, is this idea of dharani, or collective hold. I think is how he, our translator, I guess, translated it. So yeah, a collective hold, dharani, an important one. For me, that term sort of evokes Indra's net, this idea of things all being kind of held together in this interpenetrating, interconnected sort of way, and it's this holding together that allows them to exist in a real way. So I think those are perhaps the most important terms. We got King Samadhi here again, and Samadhi being, as well as a couple mentions of just truth, as well as I think he got the Greek word in here at some point as well, which I don't know Greek, but I think it's aletheia, if I'm not wrong. As I've heard that term before. Yeah, it's on the
I
bottom.
thought that was something Heidegger tended to use, like the uncovering. So it's Greek then.
Yeah, and then he put German in parentheses. Unverbogenheit. Unverbogenheit. Okay. I'm guessing that's probably like uncovering. Any German speakers here?
That sounds right. I don't know for Bogan specifically.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
He also
I think
translates Tathagata as thus coming.
Yeah, that's interesting, huh? Yeah, it connects to perhaps some of that eschatological discussion towards the end. But yeah, I hadn't seen that that translation of Tathagata before.
Actually, he may have just put it in parentheses as referring to the same thing. I don't know if it's a translation now that I look more carefully.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So we got all these terms, and any
there's
other
one other one that I think is important.
Mm-hmm.
Is preaching and non-preaching.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That, I think I had one of those sections that talks about that as one of the important ones to discuss. The preaching and the non-preaching. I thought that was a really interesting bit on 194 there. Perhaps we can, because that's pretty close to the beginning here. Perhaps we can read out this passage and go from there. So I'll take it from here, sort of in the middle of page. Of course, although we speak of the preaching of the Dharma, this is not to suggest that we have words on the one side and the Dharma on the other. The word uttered in preaching is the Dharma itself, just as it is. The Dharma is always preaching itself in and through the phenomena whose Dharma it is. Hence, the preaching may be called a preaching without words, a preaching of non-preaching. Further, since Dharma does not exist apart from the things of the Dharma, we can say that in the preaching of the Dharma, it is things that do the preaching. In being just what they are, things themselves show their own Dharma. And while they are preaching about their own Dharma, things can be said to be preaching about themselves. Of course, we can also say that the Dharma preaches about the things whose own intrinsic essence it shapes. These four facets, the Dharma preaching itself in phenomena, the Dharma preaches about phenomena, that the phenomena preach about the Dharma, and that the phenomena preach about themselves, come down to one and the same koto, and the whole constitutes the meaning of dharmic preaching. That was a great passage. I really like how he sort of separated it out into these four aspects, but then concluded with, well, this is really all one koto, one matter, where you have the things and their meanings, and the things sort of disclose their own meanings, and the meanings disclose their own things, and the things disclose themselves. It just kind of clicks for me. It works for me. I think this connects a lot with what he's been saying for the past couple chapters about a convergence of is and ought, where the dharma of a thing is preached by the thing itself, where you could translate dharma as law, as I don't know. Dharma is a notoriously hard word to translate. Teaching, certainly, in a Buddhist context, but I think this is a pretty good schema for understanding, especially the passage from Basho on the next page over. From the pine tree, learn the koto of the pine tree, and from the bamboo, the koto of the bamboo. I don't know. It's hard to put into better words what he already put down, but I don't know.
Yeah.
It seems important.
Yeah, I like that bit as well. And then right after that, he said there's a master here who, without preaching himself, makes things preach the Dharma, makes them reveal their own Dharma. While at the same time, he lets them reveal themselves and makes the Dharma preach itself as well as things. And after all, the Dharma is nothing other than this master's preaching of non-preaching. So I'm assuming the master there is like the home ground of some subjectivity that sort of allows things to preach their dharma, like properly express their own home ground, rather than kind of covering them over with either the senses or reason.
Yeah, that's a great point. The language is interesting though, because master is a very personal sounding term. I mean, certainly in our Abrahamic religions, that is a close word to some of the descriptors for God, as king or sovereign, or even father. But obviously, he's not talking about something as a personal being there, and I guess that's why we get master in the quotes rather than just sort of as a straightforward term. But I mean, and then we get King Samadhi too.
Yeah,
So
I
I
was
mean,
thinking
there's
about that.
there's some interesting play with some of these terms, which have this kind of personal tinge to them, even as they are perhaps more transparently using this kind of personified language to point to something that's impersonal or transpersonal here. I guess for me, this master, in quotes, is the self on the field of Śūnyatā, basically. So.
I had a question that's probably hard to answer. I guess I'm not entirely sure the difference between dogma and dharma.
Dogma and dharma? Interesting. Yeah. Dogma, dharma. I mean, we have two very different terms here in some ways, but I can see how they converge in a lot of ways as well. In a sort of Buddhist Studies 101 class, I feel like you get the idea that dharma is the teaching of the Buddha, the Buddha's dharma. But especially in sort of its historical usage, this Sanskrit term is difficult to pin down, and especially in Hindu philosophy, you get a lot more of sense of dharma as law, as sort of the natural law of things, but it still also has that connotation of like a teaching. And then in sort of early early Buddhist philosophy, I think it's the Abhidharma school, took Dharma as almost the idea of like an entity at a particular moment. It's sort of almost like in an atomistic sort of way. Like a Dharma was kind of an irreducible piece of being or something. And they created this really complex system of metaphysics that talked about how causation worked, like moment to moment and such. And it was all about these how these different dharmas interacted. And then the Mahayana school that Nishitani draws on so consistently throughout this was kind of a reaction against a lot of that Abhidharma metaphysics that really kind of presented a strong ontology, and so that's when you start getting the Mahayana reaction, like, oh, well, no, you can't always view this through such a being-centered lens and such discrete kind of logic. It's more complicated than that, and so that's when they kind of brought in emptiness. So that's kind of what I have in the back of my mind when I hear this word dharma. So it has a lot of different meanings. Dogma, on the other hand, I guess I see a positive and a negative connotation with that word, where the negative is sort of this idea of like a dogmatic sort of matter where you sort of need to fall in line with an orthodoxy on a specific matter. But especially I feel like in Catholicism, you have a very positive idea of dogma as a teaching, as what's been given by the church, by the tradition, as this sort of expansive, merciful kind of sense of the kind of robust theology that they want to pass on. So I think in that sense you have some overlap with this idea of dharma, but I don't think dharma ever quite has the same sense of like a very discrete sort of right kind of what's the word? Not like propositional kind of logic that that dogma does. Dogma, I feel like you can, even in a more positive light, it is these propositions about theology or metaphysics, where even when you view dharma as like the Buddha's teachings, I feel like in its particular Buddhist flavor, you can't quite reduce these things to metaphysical propositions in the same way.
Can I add on to that, Jared?
Yes, please.
So, okay, if I understand right, this is one of those concepts that comes to Buddhism from the Indian thought world. And if I understand it, in Hinduism, it has a connotation of like obligation or duty.
Yeah, that too.
So the classic kind of tale about Dharma is, I think it's in the Bhagavad Gita, right?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
is it Krishna and Arjuna?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think Arjuna is about to go on the battlefield against his brother. Correct me if I get any of the details.
Like a cousin family.
Yeah. And he's stressed out because he doesn't want to kill a family member. And Krishna basically appears to him and incarnates himself as some other deity. I forget whom.
Krishna is the incarnation of Vishnu,
but he shows his true face as who's the deity he's an incarnation of.
They got too
I
many.
want to say Vishnu. I could be wrong.
Yeah,
a very important deity.
It's either Vishnu or Shiva, I feel like.
Yeah, if you saw it, it would blow your mind. So he shows himself to Arjuna and basically says, you need to accept your
dharma.
Your karma. So karma is kind of what moves along. It's like the train that moves along the tracks of dharma, right? can anyone help me out here?
Yeah,
that's
no,
about what I got on
I
this
think
subject.
that's helpful. I think this idea of sort of a ethical, moral obligation as dharma, while simultaneously dharma is sort of the natural law. I think that is helpful in this context, that these were kind of thought of as under this same umbrella of one term. The sort of ought of nature and the ought of human moral life was the same kind of ought. It's all this dharma, and so I think perhaps we see a sort of hermeneutic return to that kind of perspective in Nishitani here, but one that has gone through these stages of self-consciousness and then sort of integrated and returned, rather than to use a somewhat crass term, a primitive sort of unity of a natural ought and a human ought.
But this is a question that's interesting to me generally. Is in Buddhism they use lots of Indian terms that come out of Vedic religion. The question is just how conversant do we need to be in this other tradition in order to understand it in Buddhism, because Buddhism changes the terms, changes the valuations in lots of places. And then even within Buddhism, it might mean different things according to different traditions. Right. So, you could get lost real easy and go down this Indian track. Or you could look at what it means in a particular traditional Buddhist context.
Yeah, I think it is really helpful to have some knowledge of this Hindu philosophy or Indian philosophy, and the different schools of Indian thought. I think their darshana is the term, which I think in the Sanskrit means like ways of seeing or something like that. Yeah, it's interesting stuff, but I think you're very right that Buddhism in its various forms took these terms and really put a new spin on them in a lot of cases, but they kind of retain a tinge of some of the old context. So was that a helpful discussion of dharma and dogma?
That was very helpful.
Sure. All righty. Anything else about the phenomena and the dharma preaching each other and themselves? All right. I think, Connor, do you have a passage you want to get to now? Otherwise, I have one on 198.
Yeah, I had one on 197 where he said,
Perfect.
In true existence, true being is one with the truth of time. To be means to be as time. While living in the passing of time, one's life is at every step a birth, sive, unbirth. And then he uses that phrase, it's life in which one whiles away one's time, accepting whatever may come. So this existence, while always in time, is always at the beginning of time. While it is a life given through parents, it is yet before the parents had been born. Of course, this before is not a mere priority of temporal occurrence. It is rather the beginning of the origination of time itself, the before of the origination of temporality. So that speaks to me a lot of, I don't know, maybe what like Eckhart Tolle, for example, talks about with the now as or like the quote of, I think it was in the New Testament where Jesus says, before something I am. So it's like a continuous, but before temporality. So I'm assuming he's talking about on the field of Śūnyatā, or in a state of samadhi, you're like out, not outside time, like because he says to be means to be as time. So yeah, I wanted to like dig into that and see what you guys thought.
Anyone have ideas before I give my take here? All right, I'll jump in. So I put a note next to this passage on my previous read through here, and I said, "The world worlds as becoming. Thus, the world in its fullness is time." So I think viewing time as as sort of change, as becoming, it sort of implies this idea of impermanence and finitude and nihility more broadly. And so looking at this in light of his arguments throughout the book, that that sort of true being is being sive nihility, or being sive nothingness, it makes sense that uh, uh, this true existence would be sort of one with time, or in time, because in time you have flux, you have change, you have this impermanence, and that is right at the sort of the ground of any particular being that exists. We're not in some kind of static world of forms that are sort of separate from time and such, but that real existence of things is fully united in time, or as he says, even exist as time, as their change and their becoming. So yeah, I think his language in that bit is difficult to penetrate. What does it mean to be as time? That is so abstract, but that was basically the way I was able to parse it there, and it seems to track pretty well.
Yeah, it seems like he's kind of coming once again at his core thesis through another route, using time as a way of describing that the true self is empty, in the sense that it's, well, yeah, the impermanence, which is like one of the three marks of existence or something. Like he's kind of using that to get at, once again, what being is on the field of Śūnyatā, that the true existence is nebulous itself, because it's always changing. Yeah, I just thought that was a good section also.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really quite profound, because I mean, even just sort of taking his previous idea of sort of the unity of the one and the particular, like that's a graspable idea. I mean, it's still abstract and difficult, but if you try and continue to sort of grasp that idea while in motion, like not as sort of a static thing, like, oh, you have these particulars united into this whole, but as a particulars that are changing and fading away, and new existences that are popping up, it's more difficult to conceptualize and sort of grasp that vision of things. But I mean, instead of saying like, oh, this is kind of a difficulty, I mean, he flips it over and is like, no, that's what makes it actually real and authentic.
Yeah, McGilchrist says that only the right hemisphere can detect things as permanent through time, like a flow or pattern that's consistent, even though it's still changing.
It's maybe a little off topic. Have any of you seen the movie Donnie Darko?
I have not yet.
It's been recommended to me repeatedly.
Because I actually just watched it, and I was recommended by someone to watch it because they didn't understand it at all. And I think this is what it's talking about. So I don't want to ruin the movie at all.
So which movie was it? I wasn't able to hear you.
Donnie Darko. It's from 2001. It has Jake Gyllenhaal in it and a bunch of other people. But it's about someone with schizophrenia. And I can't really describe anything else about it, like without making you think some type of way about it, you know?
Sure.
All I know is it's got a rabbit in it.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, that's all I say.
Sure. Yeah, I think our watch list from this group now is what was it? The Silence? Was that the movie, or Silence?
Yeah,
something like that.
Definitely recommend that one.
And Donnie Darko. So very cool.
So I want to. Okay, I got a little behind the last group, and I got caught up this reading. So there's some interesting stuff in the previous reading. Some stuff I'd like to return to later, but you just reminded me of another thing which I found interesting in the previous reading, which is this idea of the particular as that which is not substitutable for anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Right? that's a really interesting definition of the particular or the concrete, is that, whatever it is that you can't swap out for some other thing. And I feel like this is really, it's relevant to McGilchrist and this idea of the right brain, because I often get into a mode of thought, which I feel is up there somewhere, in which I feel as though things can be substituted, that other people don't agree can be substituted, right? So this sense or this feeling that, everything's the same, right? I think that is what he is speaking against. He's saying that, no, everything is not the same. Things have a hexaity to them. They're non-substitutable. But I run up again and again in my personal life on the sense that, no, things are substitutable.
I found that really weird when he brought that up, because he's always telling he's always talking about talking about nothingness and how nothing is permanent, everything is ephemeral, and then all of a sudden he inserted that line about something being unique and particular. I didn't understand. Actually, that one sentence in particular I found very jarring. It seemed uncharacteristic of him to say, "Oh no, but this is special. This is unique." I didn't really quite understand it. I understood the idea. I don't know why he was bringing it up. I don't understand the context.
Let's
I think
find
it's something you need to address if you want to talk about the allness of everything or the nothingness of everything. Is sooner or later someone's going to point out that, well, actually, if you spend 100 hours studying French, you're not going to be able to speak Chinese, right? There are some places that you can't get from here.
I think he would probably say that within a given moment of time, remember the circle diagram, like the sensory and then the rational, maybe less so the rational aspects of a given thing would be like utterly unique in particular, but the home ground is universal and shared in emptiness. So like when I was first reading this, that not contrast, well, I guess contrast that is integrated stuck out to me as well. And I really liked that notion. I thought it was quite beautiful of each particular being utterly unique and irreplaceable. And McGilchrist also does talk about the right hemisphere having a grasp on, well, not so much a grasp, but understanding the universal and the particular, whereas the left hemisphere understands types and categories that are fungible and substitutable.
Go on.
Oh, and then like the left hemisphere, I feel like kind of that taking over in some sense is what happens when people go into like the nihility and they're still trying to find a static substance that the left hemisphere understands, even though at core, like there's the universals and the particulars, and then the substitutable types are kind of after those two things. They're not as primary, I feel like.
So okay, you said in this model, the right hemisphere is responsible for both the universal and the particular, and it's the categories, it's that which lies in between, which is the province of the left hemisphere.
Yes.
It makes me think of a book I read called Finite and Infinite Games. Has anyone ever seen this?
I've heard the guy talk, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, likewise. I hear a lot about this game A, game B sort of stuff online, and I know there's a community sort of around it, especially on Discord, I think. So I'm familiar with the basic idea of finite versus infinite games, but that's about as far as I'd say I'm exposed to it.
So it's been a long time since I read it. It's an interesting little book. I got it lying around somewhere and should probably reread it. But one thing he said stuck with me, which is that he said, okay, so he defines abstract and concrete as abstract is that which is isolated from the whole, right? It is abstracted from the whole. It is isolated. The concrete is that which is connected to the whole. Right. So I found that really interesting because that is the opposite of how I usually think of concrete. I usually think of the whole as an abstraction and the particular as concrete. He's turning that on its head. So that makes me think I don't really understand what is concrete and what is abstract, or what is particular and what is universal. I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, I think abstraction would also be something McIlchrist would describe the left hemisphere as doing. Like it's representing rather than the direct presencing. And I think Nishitani would sort of describe that as when the cogito looks at itself and then reifies itself as like it abstracts and then thinks that the abstraction is the fundamental reality, which it isn't.
Yeah, this is interesting. I'm just pulling up the etymology of abstract. Yeah, so Latin word meaning to draw away, withdraw, remove. So etymologically, makes sense that the abstracted would be removed, withdrawn from the whole, or something is implied that it is being drawn away from. So yeah, interesting.
It's just funny that I'm sorry, I'm going to be perfectly honest. As I'm participating in this discussion, I'm preparing PowerPoints for a class to a bunch of Chinese sixth graders. I have to teach them about subject verb agreement. So I'm literally teaching Asians the difference between a subject and an object as we're having this conversation.
Interesting. Wonderful. Yeah, I mean it's baked right into our language there, but not universally necessarily. Interesting. Yeah, so back to this universal and particular. I feel like this is a place where he really is on the same sort of line as the object oriented ontology people, where they have these two ideas, one of resistance and the other of availability, where the resistance of an object or a entity, a specific thing, is sort of the uniqueness of it, the particularity of it, that can't be reduced to other things. And the availability is sort of the flip side of it. It's the aspect of the object that is interconnected, is participating in other objects, is available for relation, for reduction, for abstraction in various ways. And what the object-oriented people ultimately claim is for something to be real, it has to have both of these aspects to it. Where if it was only resistant, it would be entirely inaccessible. It's not related to any other objects. It doesn't have relations or interactions. So there'd be no way to access it from anywhere. Whereas if a object is entirely available without resistance, it just gets subsumed into something else. It's just an aspect of something rather than something that's real as a particular, as its own object. So I think he's trying to make a similar move here and show how kind of a particularity and a universal are very codependent in a lot of ways, and the uniqueness of a particular is an essential aspect that particularizes it to participate in universality, perhaps.
Yeah.
Cool. Glad I got that one right.
Yeah, it almost seems like the resistance thing could be construed as what Christianity eventually led to with like the deism, where God was like totally inaccessible at that point and disconnected from the world, which then kind of led into existentialism.
Just one moment here.
As opposed to having any availability.
You guys would really like Donnie Darko.
Nice. Yeah, I've heard a lot about it. I always hear it mentioned, but haven't seen it yet. So yeah, maybe with some of these movies we could do some kind of movie night. Someone could stream and we could discuss afterwards or something, because we got time before the next group that we could schedule some interesting stuff. So anyway, and anything else from those previous sections, anything from last week's reading? Because I feel like it's a bit more contextualized now that we got to this section 5 here.
Yes, but I feel that it is going to derail the conversation considerably, so maybe
Okay.
it could wait towards the end.
Sure. All right, I have one more quote, or actually I think I have 2 more quotes. Yeah, 2 more quotes from this section 5 here we can dig into, and then we can shift to these last 2 sections with a very new topic. So all right, on 198, starting right at the top, when asked what God had been doing during the boundless stretch of time prior to the creation of the world, Augustine replied that time itself was created by God together with the world. In a similar sense, before the birth of the parents is the before of time itself, the beginning of the origination of time. This beginning lies directly beneath the dropped off body and mind. It is before all temporal before, all temporally imminent beginnings as well. The beginning of time itself is before all possible pasts, and it is likewise after all possible futures. Past events, no matter how far back they go, and future events, no matter how far ahead they reach, gather together at the home ground of the beginning of time. Interesting stuff. I want to bring in a koan that I really like here that's very, very related. The koan goes, "Show me your original face, the face you had before your parents were born."
Yeah, so that takes us to another thing he spoke about in this chapter, which is the horizontal eyes and the vertical nose.
Yeah, I've
So-
always wanted to know what the relation is with those facial parts, horizontal and vertical. I mean, I know that they sort of look like that, but what does he mean by horizontal and vertical? And like, why is that inside?
I think perhaps it goes very simply back to this idea of dharma. The dharma of the face is eyes horizontal, nose vertical. It's just how it is. That is what it's preaching, so to speak. I'm sure you could sort of get into a more kind of symbolic, phenomenological approach to it, and kind of abstract some meaning of having vertical eyes and a horizontal nose. But I think that's a bit removed from what he's probably trying to do with it in this kind of koanic sense.
I agree, and I mean I think you put your finger on kind of the difference between a koan and a symbol, right? So I mean we talked in some previous group, it might have been back in Corban, about the symbolism of the cross and how it's a meeting of horizontal and vertical, and of course horizontal and vertical, I mean they have all these different connotations that you could tease out.
Yeah.
But I don't really think that's what he's talking about.
Right. It is interesting, though. I know Meister Eckhart did quite a bit with the symbolism of the cross and the significance of the vertical and the horizontal with that. And I'm pretty sure something with it had to do with time. So, I mean, I'm guessing there is resonance with that perspective in Nishitani here, given how high of a pedestal he gives Meister Eckhart in this work. But yeah, I think this is interesting. This idea of the beginning of time being right underfoot and being so connected with this idea of time in general, and sort of a unity of existential time and quote unquote objective time, where the beginning of time is right there. The creation of the universe by God, and the coming into existence of the subject are that sort of primordial beginningness of the time is sort of coexistent with both of those things.
Yeah, it might end up having some physics correlation, like Alexander Bard talks about, more recent idea in physics is the idea of hypertime underlying time as we know it, which is more relative to that. And then,
yeah, last time I read this text in a discussion group, one of the participants was a physics student, and he got really mad about how Nishitani used the word infinite. So it's interesting how some of these discussions connect or don't with the hard sciences. So interesting. Yeah, I just found some notes I have on Eckhart with the symbolism of the cross. Interesting. Uh-huh. Yeah, so the horizontal of the cross is apparently represents purely worldly experience. So like kind of the everyday journey through time, through life. Whereas the horizontal is sort of the revelatory, the mystical, the messianic, even the sort of thing that comes from just out of the heavens down to earth and kind of shatters the worldly, the everyday, with something surprising and new and insightful. So if you only have this vertical dimension, you're sort of a disconnected, disembodied mystic in a negative sense, where if you are just stuck on the horizontal, you're just living kind of a purely worldly experience. Could say it's self-centered, certainly, and prone to nihility. So Eckhart's vision is that you need the cross. You need these two aspects integrated, which makes sense, and I think that works really well with what Nishitani's putting out here too.
Yeah, I feel like later in this chapter, when he talks about how Christianity eventually tries to historicize its own like eschatology, or that's how they perceive like the end of the world will be a historic event. Almost seems like they're trying to they're trying to make that connection between the horizontal and the vertical, but there's a kind of a shallow version of it that I feel like I've seen in some Protestant interpretations where the vertical is lacking, even though it's propositionally there in the words. Like Vervaeke talks about the narrative order being horizontal and the ontological order being the vertical. Yeah, I think you can possibly connect that to what he critiques later in this chapter on the Christianity as focusing on the historical aspect of time, kind of like fusing it to their eschatology without having any sort of circular, like I feel like he's kind of trying to have both the circular and the linear as kind of a spiral, maybe, whereas like the more reductive interpretations of like eschatology and Protestantism like just have the linear.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. So there's one more quote I want to get to in section 5 before we jump into some of this historical discussion with Toynbee and Nietzsche. So let's get that out of the way, and then we can pick up that thread. So on 200, he writes, "If there is nothing here that is not in one's own treasure house and at one's own disposition to use as one wishes, we have no cause to inflict a wound on this order by letting an act of reflective thought intervene, by fashioning an eyeball for it. No sooner has the attitude of objective representation come to the scene than form, as something outside of the self, is generated. something that is not of one's own treasure house and not at one's own disposition shows up. Chaos dies. One has already deviated from observance. So this is perhaps the most poetic he's been in his critique of representation and perhaps cogito as well. But I was interested in some of this language and really curious to get Christian's perspective as he talked about this idea of the wound a couple times before. But yeah, an interesting little argument here about how sort of being the master, being at one's own home ground in this non-objective field of Śūnyatā is actually what puts things at one's own in one's own treasure house at one's own disposition. But I mean, you're obviously not then engaging in this through your egoic modes. So anything more to say with that one? All right, we shall move onward. Section 6 here. All right, we get Toynbee. Anyone familiar with Toynbee outside of this text? No. Hey, is that a yes, Andrew?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was off mute. Yeah, familiar, but I've never read him.
Okay.
So
all right. So
I'm more familiar with this. Okay. So he actually brings up Feuerbach in this chapter. And I remember I mentioned him in the Corban discussion group. I had a history professor who really emphasized this idea of progress in history and its distinctness from historical progress or progress in religion. That was kind of the subject of an entire semester long course. So yeah, it's a really big idea in Western intellectual history beyond Toynbee, and I think Nishitani's putting his finger on something here.
Yeah, definitely so. So the basic idea he's drawing from Toynbee here at the first bit is this sort of cleave between the Western Judaic traditions and the Buddhaic traditions of the East, and they're basically their metaphysics. And so Toynbee's saying that Buddhaic thought has a cyclical time, and Western Judaic thought is much more linear, even in its variety of perspectives. The two main ones that are discussed being this, I guess the three. Well, no, two. You got the eschatological and then the progress vision of history here, and they're kind of diametrically opposed in a lot of ways, but they're still kind of operating on the same software, so to speak.
So I'm super bummed Stav is not here for this discussion because it gets.
I keep waiting for him to come back. This is perfect for him.
Yeah. Hope he catches the video or something. I'd be really curious to hear what he has to say. But it gets into the question of, is there a Judeo-Christian tradition, right? This is a pretty familiar conceit of sort of identifying the whole of the Western tradition with its Judaic kind of substratum or whatever. I think there's a grain of truth there, but it's a really problematic idea, especially because even within Judaism, you definitely have a cyclic and a linear component down to the holidays. The Jewish calendar is derived from the Babylonian calendar, and so you have certain festivals which more or less correspond to pagan rituals that you would have in any other religion, right? Harvest festivals, spring festivals, festivals of lights and things of that nature. And then you have other festivals which are clearly intended to stand outside of the cyclical pagan calendar. Yeah, I am. Okay. Let me log. Hold on. I gotta log off. I'll be right back.
Sure. I'll pick up where you left off there. Yeah, I mean, this whole idea of the Judeo-Christian is really kind of new and very political in its origins. I don't think it was really at all used prior to the 1950s. Certainly not prior to the 20th century. I mean, just considering the kind of rampant anti-Semitism that characterized much of Europe throughout history, and to some degrees still in current times, the whole idea of the Judeo and the Christian being sort of this united, cohesive whole is kind of strange. I think you can make an argument for it, but I don't think you can make an argument for it as like an isolated thing. So what kind of peeves me about Judeo-Christian is isolating this Judeo-Christian from an Islamic element as well. I think there's a much better argument to be made for sort of Abrahamic civilization rather than Judeo-Christian, and then Islam something separated. I mean, just looking at the history of the Middle Ages with all the interaction between these Islamic theologians, someone like Maimonides, and your sort of great Catholic theologians like Aquinas. It's like very, very interconnected, and with all those characters. So it seems like Toynbee's idea of Western Judaic does include the Islamic as sort of a broader Abrahamic tradition. So I think in that respect, his divide here does make a bit more sense than just sort of Judeo-Christian versus non-Western or something.
Actually, before we move on, I did have something to say about that quote you had on 200. I just forgot it.
Sure, go ahead.
Initially, where he says, you inflict a wound on the order by letting an active reflective thought intervene, and no sooner than you do that and representation comes on the scene than form as something outside of the self is generated. So it almost sounds like he's critiquing form in and of itself, even though he kind of has a more positive valence for order as something that you don't need to represent because it already is in order. So would you say that he's like critiquing form in a very general sense? Like, I wonder if he's fine with it as long as you understand that it is a representation, or
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I think he's fine with it in its proper place,
right,
which seems about right. But I think especially here with the capital form in quotations, I think there he's probably referring to a Platonic idea as very much that kind of abstracted away outside of time, outside of particulars. But yeah, I think on 197 at the top, he has a good quote about kind of where logos and reason fit in. Logos in its fullest sense, primarily on the home ground of that existence, and the logos of speculative reason or discursive understanding develops from this primary point to the dimension of reason or understanding. Insofar as it is seen only on those dimensions, logos is no longer a revelation of the suchness of things. In order to become a revelation, such a revelation, logos has thus developed must always be brought back to its primary point, the home ground of empty existence that opens itself up as the field of Śūnyatā itself. So he's cool with our rationality, our discursive reason, but we always need to keep returning that to the field of Śūnyatā, of the self of no self, of the non-ego, for it to allow the light of the Dharma or the phenomena to shine forth, and illuminate that form on its own sort of order, in its own sort of order, on its own terms.
Yeah, that section there reminds me a lot of Vervaeke's language, where the propositional is grounded on top of the perspectival and the participatory, like the logos starts there, those kinds of knowing, and then reason is just like the most recent one, but it thinks it's the only one sometimes.
Yeah, certainly so. All right. Did you hear my little spiel about the Judeo-Christian and Abrahamic, Andrew? Did you catch
At the
that?
end of it, with basically this question of where Islam fits there. I don't know if I missed anything before then.
Yeah, not too much, but yeah, it seems like Toynbee's idea of the Western Judaic is somewhat similar to the idea of Abrahamic as a whole, which I think is a better way to parse things off than Judeo-Christian versus like non-Western. So I think he's onto something a bit here, in dividing the Dharmic from the Abrahamic.
Yeah. What's really funny is when people use Judeo-Christian in contrast to like Islamic, as though they're from like two starkly different lineages, when the real difference is the Eastern Asian tradition.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, even that, if you look at like Vedic Hinduism, you see a lot that is similar to your Western sort of polytheisms, and so I know there's at least some hypothesis of a common origin of all religion, sort of in that kind of Aryan prehistory there, because you can find some kind of surprising similarities, linguistic and sort of anthropological, between these early polytheistic traditions.
I think the person who articulated that most strongly of like a common origin between Indian religion and Abrahamic religion is Huxley. Aldous Huxley.
In his perennial philosophy.
Yeah, he pretty much came out and said that. I think that the reality is a little more complicated within each tradition. You definitely have cyclical and linear aspects within each tradition. It gets real complicated in Christianity. Really, all the Abrahamic traditions, when you look at the way that pagan philosophy was incorporated into all three, right? I think it's pretty hard to find a pure case. But by and large, these Dharmic religions, they do appear less interested in history. I think that's fair.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the liturgical calendar that factors so strongly in any of these Abrahamic faiths. Like, that's very cyclical, whether it's a moon calendar or a sun calendar. Like, you still got a cycle that is at the heart of the religious life there. But I guess you could say it's very wrapped up in the idea of narrative, even in that situation, and that sort of connects back to this conception of self-centered personality, where I don't think in the cyclical approach of the Dharmic faiths you have quite that same narrative sort of component to the cyclicalness of time.
Yeah. Okay. That takes me back to the thing I wanted to say, but maybe we should conclude our discussion of chapter or of section 6 before we.
I think you can go ahead. I think if it's relevant, take us away.
So I want to take it back to let's see if I can find the part in chapter 4 or section 4, I should say. So he gets into talking about meaning versus meaninglessness, and how we basically run aground on a paradox, right? where I want to find his exact words. Shoot, I thought I had this. Hold on. Here we go. Page 180. Where ratio is pushed to its true extreme, the irrational shows up. Where meaning is pushed to its extreme, meaninglessness shows up. And yet what thus appears as a paradox, irrationality or meaninglessness, is truly absolute reality. It is the living vitality of life itself. To say here that life as such is meaningless is to say that life is truly living itself. It is, in other words, a point where life transcends all meaning, albeit a point where all meaning is able to be constituted as meaning only in relationship to that point. It is the point that Meister Eckhart calls Leben ohne Warum, life without a reason why. It is the same with the claim that paradox is the truth and that irrationality is the ratio. Okay, so this is something that's very interesting to me and is connected with things that are on my mind outside of this book, which is when we talk about something being meaningless or meaningful, what is that? This is a term which is tossed around very liberally, and it's very difficult to define rigorously. Meaning, right? It's something that has direct relevance for me in my work as a language teacher, right? When you say that something means something, what does that mean? So you could adopt the perspective of semiotics, right, which divides things into sign and signifier. You could say the meaning, the sign is the form, and the meaning is the signified, right? It is the thing that is referred to out of the arbitrary, outside of an arbitrary signifier. But that doesn't really clarify matters, because what is this thing that is referred to outside? What is meaning? It's a very it's a very broad question, but it's very troubling to me.
Yeah. It seems like in that semiotics perspective, it's very Kantian. You have this signified that is sort of the noumena. I mean, you get these signifiers that are supposedly pointing to it, but you never get the signified sort of in its pure form. So I think Nishitani is rejecting that. What sort of stuck out to me thinking through these things is that the way we often approach meaning is very much as an abstraction, it's a reduction of the phenomena or object into some rational representation or some other kind of representation. So I think Nishitani's perspective on meaning and why life becomes meaningful when it's meaningless is very much about this, what we started with, this idea of the phenomena preaching the Dharma and the Dharma preaching the phenomena. So if we stop this abstracting process of meaning making, of trying to find the meaning of something, what we're left with is meaninglessness. But in that meaninglessness, that opens up the the space for us to hear that preaching, where it's united from the Dharma and phenomena.
Yeah, because when you are trying to find the meaning, you're already like looking for an abstraction, like you're already disconnected from the experience of the meaning. Like Joseph Campbell has a really good quote on this, where searching for the meaning of life is what you do when you're disconnected from the actual experience of the meaning of life. Like what we're seeking is the feeling of aliveness.
Yeah.
And then there's also what Vervaeke talks about, like Aristotle's contact epistemology, where you know things by sort of being them, or like sort of having a coherence between your representation of them and the thing itself, which is already kind of abstraction. But that first bit, I think, is one way. Have you gone through Vervaeke's series, Andrew? I would definitely recommend that.
If you have a spare 50 hours anytime in the near future.
maybe when we go back on lockdown.
Maybe.
Right. Right. All right. I'm gonna.
Well, can
Oh,
I
yeah,
say one
please.
more other thing on that? So, I
Please.
mean, so this goes back to Kant and the overturning of Aristotle. Is I feel like this idea of meaning is connected in Aristotle with this idea of a telos, of
Mm-hmm.
things having an inborn objective or sort of endpoint that they evolve toward. That's all I got.
Yeah, I agree. I think with I guess I kind of started with Aquinas, but there was like he started the process, he didn't finish it, but there was a kind of removal of the Aristotle's formal and final causes in the West eventually, where we're just left with the efficient and material causes, so just like materialism, matter and motion, and so on. And yeah, so that got rid of telos in general. I feel like that is a major cultural problem that Nietzsche obviously was talking about. And there's another framework I like. It's not so much semantic wise for meaning, but like the 4 pillars of meaning being a narrative, purpose, transcendence, and belonging or like coherence within some sort of community. If you're wanting to go more broadly, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think, I mean, teleology definitely connects to so many of these discussions he's having right now, and I mean, definitely in this last chapter, he's going to deal with it very, very directly. But I mean, teleology, it's basically an ought. It's what something is ought to go towards, develop towards in time. So I mean, what could be more relevant to this thesis here? But I mean, it is problematic because we do view it in this sort of abstracted representational sort of way, where we project the telos onto something, rather than letting it develop and sort of express its own teleology in a sort of non-teleological kind of way, because the is and the ought are already united here on this field of Śūnyatā. Okay, so I think the next thing to hit on in section 6 here is this these 3 problematic points contained in Christianity that sort of constitute historicity. So this is page 207. He says, the problematic points contained in Christianity are tied up with the 3 factors referred to above as implicit in the Christian awareness of the self-being of man: the awareness of sin, the awareness of freedom, and the awareness of the once and for all nature of time. And I think at the end of this bit, yeah, he says the 3 problems we dealt with are basically bound up with one another and reach back, if we follow them, to the notion of a divine personality and hence also a human personality. So yeah, any thoughts on these 3 aspects of Christian awareness of self-being?
Sorry, I have a bunch of notes on this. I'm just looking over them.
Mm-hmm.
This is definitely like just all out of my territory. I don't know much about any of this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is a high level theological and philosophical discussion here. So I can try and summarize it a bit. So he kind of tackles them in order a bit. So in the next paragraph down on 207, he says, in Christianity, where the beginnings of history are thought to involve sin, the coming to be and development of history on the one hand and the self-centered existence of man on the other are essentially tied up with one another. In this regard, Kant had noted that evil was taken to be the origin of history. So this gets to the Genesis story of Adam and Eve as sort of the beginning of history, with this kind of transgression as the first historical event, in a sense, though we probably wouldn't consider that historical from a sort of secular perspective, but certainly as a narrative about human personality, it's very much a historical idea.
It reminds me of something. I think it was Leon said in the Corban discussion group. That his understanding of Christianity is basically that history ends with Christ.
Right.
And so, going back to sort of the different Judeo and Christian calendars and conceptions of history, right? It's very different to have your calendar reckoned from a year that from the beginning of creation, right? That it only goes up, versus you have it extending out in two directions from a historical event.
Interesting.
I mean, in some ways, it's just like a convenience for us, since there's so much that isn't historical before like 5,000 years ago.
Right.
But I see what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
What was Leon's faith, or did that inform his idea there?
He was another guy, like a lot of us, certainly like myself, kind of between a number of faiths. He had time as a convert to Islam. He during the group was seeking initiation into Martinism. Was it some esoteric Catholic initiatic path? So yeah, I miss that guy. I'm gonna try and rope him into the next one if I can.
Yeah, there was a section that's sort of related here that I thought was really good, where he talks about Judaism as kind of covering over a self-centeredness that is just projected onto God and the religion, where like this is the outlook that determines the view of nature and history found in in contrast, according to the view of history of Western Judaic thought. Oh shit, no, that was a different section. But oh yeah, here it was. Lurking beneath the concept of a divine elect is a direct projection onto God of the wish of the Jewish people that God be severe in his judgment with other peoples. Projected onto God is the unconscious demand of the self to condemn other people. Crudely put, what we have here is a ressentiment, like Nietzsche's term, come forth in the guise of a self-centeredness that has passed through God so as to become religious. Which is pretty critical. I wish Stav was here to respond to that.
Yeah, it is very critical, and I think it's something you can find in all of these Abrahamic or Western Judaic faiths here to an extent, and I think it's definitely tied up in this idea of will quite a lot as well, the will of God. But I think he's really right in kind of trying to tie this to discussions of historicity. And he had one polemical thing. I think it might have been right around that same section where he said something like, "This has been entirely absent in Buddhist history," which I think is quite contestable. Knowing just a little bit about Buddhist history and all the wars that they had, and I mean, certainly even in Nishitani's own time in modern, or just barely pre-modern Japan, I mean, he and the Kyoto school were very involved in this nationalist Japanese sort of fascist campaign in the World War, and not to the degree that Heidegger was a literal Nazi, but I mean, certainly the Kyoto school were complicit in supporting a lot of the fascism and the imperial sort of vision of a nationalist Japan. So anyway, that was a bit of a tangent, but I think there is something right about if you, as some other religion, go up to some Buddhist person and talk about your religion, they might proselytize to you, but they're not gonna like try and kill your people as heretics for the most part. They might conquer you politically for political reasons and have religious justifications for that, but the idea of a crusade is very foreign to Buddhism for the most part, and I do think it has something to do with this idea of a more universal perspective on these things and a less historical one. If I mean, I think Christianity is perhaps the most exemplary of this, but I mean, if you have a single incarnation of God in history, like that's the one you gotta buy in, versus I mean, the Tao or Buddha nature or Brahman in the world, that could come anywhere. That could be at any point in history, in any person, any phenomena. Uh, there's a lot more of a tendency to sort of let people find it where they can, and not need to point to a singular historical event to to uh, to get them towards this path of salvation.
Yeah, I think that historical aspect is what leads to a lot of the intolerance, is the point he makes. And I mean, Islam and Judaism have it to some extent as well, with like Muhammad being the seal of the prophets, and then like Moses being a particular patriarch and doing certain things. But like he says, something about it creates a baked in intolerance, because of that historicity and like the nature of God being a more of a personal being as opposed to something more fluid or yeah, like the Tao, as you said. But yeah, in a case like this, the absoluteness generally demanded of religious truth combines with the once and for all nature of historical fact, with the result that this standpoint of faith cannot but demand exclusive absoluteness for itself. At this point, intolerance inevitably raises its head, like the consciousness of being a chosen people that appeared in the religion of Israel. We have here another case of a self-centeredness on a religious dimension, which Twomby was speaking of. Intolerance here is essentially bound up with the fact that faith comes into being here on a personal standpoint, the standpoint of a personal relationship with a personal God. This is so because in the last analysis in religion, the personal contains some sort of self-centeredness. Consequently, the faith of Christianity could not help setting off antagonisms from time to time between the self-centeredness and the other element of agape, namely the love of neighbor. And then he goes on to that quote where he says that Buddhism was lacking things like the Crusades.
Right.
I think this was quite a strong point.
Yeah. I really think, I mean, just on a personal level, some of what he articulates here is very much what makes Christianity not feel like a viable religious option for me. I think it connects so immediately with the idea of nihility that's so central in this text. Like the fact that in a Christian schema, you could be born in a time and place after Christ where you might never hear of Jesus, or might only experience kind of negative aspects of Christianity around you. Like that's a bummer. Like why would God do that? Like even if you have a more forgiving theology in a Christian context that allows for the salvation of these people who never encounter Christ, like it, I mean, it's still like they got the short straw in the picking, and that's hard to reconcile without some kind of appeal to a divinity that is beyond that of the incarnation in history.
If you don't, I'm totally with you. If you don't have a theology that allows for some kind of universalism, like David Bentley Hart does, then it just leads to absurdity. In my experience, that exact thought experiment when I was like 13 is what first kind of started turning me away from like the generic Protestantism I grew up with.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. I feel Islam fares a little better, but it certainly has some of these same issues. And I can't speak much for Judaism, but I think you still have this very historicist sort of aspect to the religion, mostly in uh, Muhammad and the Quran, but neither of those occupy quite the centrality that Jesus does within Christian schemas. So, I mean, the idea of the 99 names of God and a more theophanic creation in the Islamic view leaves much more of a door open for those people sort of outside of the historical boundaries of where the religion was able to touch. And there's a bit more of a universalist trend within Islamic theology as a whole, where it really feels like an outsider view in Christianity a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's almost like Judaism in some sense is the most exclusive, but then they don't have the negative aspect of the universalist claim of like a judgment for all that Christianity has, and then Islam is almost a little more universal in both aspects, if that makes sense. So that it's like Christianity has this middle ground that depending on the sect, it can end up looking like very kind of absurd and like terrible if it's not one of the more universalist leaning ones.
Yeah, but I mean, oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Finish thought, please.
Even when you do have the more universalist approach, though, then you have sort of the issue of nihility on the opposite side. Like, what was the point of the incarnation and the crucifixion then? So that can be, I mean, it's a solvable problem, and people have responses to it. But I think whatever sort of way you kind of swing towards more exclusivist or more universalist, I still think you have nihility bubble up somewhere in there.
Yeah, like the globalism and the cross-cultural knowledge that I don't think is going away is why I feel like someone like Jonathan Pageau's attempt to make Eastern Orthodoxy the new shared religion in the West is not going to pan out in the long term.
Right.
I was just going to say, for Judaism, I think that the issue is not so much what it is not so much like the problem is more what is the relevance of this religion to people outside of it whatsoever, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have a great deal to say about those who are outside the fold. You do have this idea within it of the Noahide laws, which is that there's basically there's a core set of commandments which all nations are obligated to follow, in which the Jews are basically supposed to be exemplary of these attributes. And I think it's interesting because they are mostly shared by all other religions, which with one notable exception, which is no idolatry, right? So that's already a pretty big ask for a large chunk of the world, right? You're already, if you're really going to insist that of others outside your fold, you're going to encounter some pushback. So anyway, I guess my point is this is something that is treated in the Jewish thought world, but it's a distant priority.
Yeah, that's also what I was trying to get at, where like Christianity makes more claims on others from other regions, so it has more to do in that sense to make it work.
Yeah. All right, shall we get on to this final section with Nietzsche here before we wrap up? Yeah, I see right at the beginning of this we have telos. So, yep, he's starting to touch on it a little bit. Interesting.
There's a section on 213 I was interested in where like he's trying to have some kind of synthesis here, it seems like. How is it possible for what we call history to carry its historicity through to its last and final trans-historical base without thereby being terminated as history at the hands of the trans-historical? In other words, how is it possible for history to become radically historical by virtue of its historicity being carried through to a trans-historical ground? The question leads us inevitably, I think, and then he says he's going to talk about it regarding Śūnyatā, which I think he gets into the next chapter, but it made me wonder if there's something to do here with like history has not yet seen the emptiness within itself in the West. So it's like history is still history, therefore it is not history. Like it's not come into its own as something grounded beyond itself. I don't know.
Well, there's a real resonant. There's another part in the earlier section that I don't think we fully unpacked, where he basically talks about death is something that ceases with death, right? That death is only something that is present as long as there is life. Once there's death, death is not a problem. So similarly, history is only an issue insofar as there is a continued unfolding. Once there's no unfolding, there's no history anymore. Everything is all happening simultaneously.
With that death quote, was he saying that's the view of the West and he was critiquing it, or I'm forgetting?
That was not my understanding. Let me see if I can find the relevant quote. Why don't you guys go on, please?
Sure. Yeah. Just to touch on Nietzsche a bit. So, I mean, he has pretty high praise for what Nietzsche is doing with this idea of eternal recurrence. He seems to like it better than either a progress or eschatological orientation to history, because these both are very linear, narrative focused interpretations of history that sort of confine history to its own standpoint in a sense, where in the eternal recurrence you have some kind of attempt to try and kind of reconcile these linear and cyclical interpretations. But Nishitani ultimately says that Nietzsche gets more towards a regression to the mythic standpoint, because he's not able to fully integrate sort of the historical and the ahistorical, or the meaningless and the meaningful, perhaps. On 212, he writes, insofar as the will to power comes down in the final analysis to a worldview of eternal recurrence, it is my view that the meaning it gives to history at its last and final ground on the field of ecstatic transcendence is based only on a negative pole. So you don't have this sort of positive, life-giving or affirmative aspect integrated. So I think it connects earlier with a few chapters back what he was talking about with Nietzsche, how he gets to a relative absolute nothingness. So we don't have this full sive in this eternal recurrence. It's sort of a partial way there.
Yeah, what did he mean by the negative pole? Because I mean, Nietzsche himself near the end is always talking about like yes saying, and seems to have a very positive, life affirming philosophy in theory.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's because it's sort of achieved through this negation or nihility, in a sense.
Or like it has a negative view of emptiness and just calls it nihility and constantly needs to like will something new into being, maybe
something like that, perhaps. I mean, it sounds like a lot of how we get to eternal recurrence and the will to power is through very sort of harsh negation. It's a negation of the historical, and I mean, you do get to a life affirming and an affirmative perspective, but it doesn't have this sort of dual root through affirmation of the particular, of the historical in the beginning. So it's kind of one-sided. You have a historical which is negated to achieve the transhistorical or ahistorical, but you don't have a negation of the ahistorical transhistorical to fully realize the radical historicity of things, which makes sense because eternal recurrence, you're not getting that full newness, that radical newness of history that Nishitani thinks is important to preserve.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how he almost seems to be describing Nietzsche's attempt as like a new synthesis or integration that doesn't do either one proper justice, even though it kind of it tries to do both. Like when he says it's a regression to mythos, when he talks about the Dionysian and internal recurrence, like they're more symbolic rather than actual. So, or no, he's saying in that sense, Nietzsche's image of time, it robs, or those concepts rob the image of time of both its historicity and its actuality. So I assume he means like eternal recurrence robs things of their historicity because they're not seen as like a particular point in time that actually happened just once. And then it's also not actual in the sense that he's still using kind of mythic language, like not getting to the direct experience of the home ground of reality.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think perhaps 216 has an important quote for this. So he talks briefly of comparing the will to power to this Hindu Vedantic idea of Brahman and Atman, the Tattvam Asi, thou art that. And he says, although from Nietzsche's stance, we can say that ourself is, in fact, that, we cannot yet say that in itself is, in fact, ourself. In other words, although one can speak of a self that is not a self, one cannot yet speak of a self that is not self. This brings us to a fundamental difference between the position of Nietzsche and the position of Zen, which speaks, for example, of the existence of body and mind dropped off body and mind, as the king samadhi's samadhi of oneself as such, with eyes horizontal and nose vertical.
Yeah, I like underlined that part like 3 times when I first read through, and I remember concentrating to try and grok what he's talking about. It was really good though, and I think the next sentence actually helped a bit for me, where he says that the will to power involves within it something that is not yet completely reverted back into the self, indicates that it is still being represented as a being that is. Like if it had been completely so reverted back into like the self, I assume he means like the true self on Śūnyatā, then there would not be so much as a single strand capable of representation as a being left on the ecstatic transhistorical dimension of existence in the body.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. I think yeah, it's sort of purely ecstatic. It's purely standing outside of the self, and insofar as it is outside of the self, it's represented as this eternal recurrence, as this system that is sort of rationally conceived versus this very existential idea of sort of living as time or existing as time, which, yeah, I don't know, that does feel like if we try and drop off all this rational conception, it really does feel in life like there is both this very cyclical aspect to it and this very new aspect to it that just pops up at points. So I think that's what he's trying to get us towards is a unity of those two, where they kind of condition and create each other. All right. Any final thoughts on this section for this week?
Or did you find that other quote, Andrew?
I found more like a long passage, which I digested and rephrased in my mind. So I didn't find a single Zinger quote to encapsulate what I took out of it.
Did he seem to be critical of that view of death that you mentioned, or was that like more his view? Did it seem?
My understanding, if I understood him, okay, so it's this whole section. Let me see if I can at least find the oh man, it's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
That's fine.
It's a lot of stuff. But if I understood him correctly, he's basically saying that this understanding of you want to arrive at this understanding that death is basically an artifact of life, of the perspective of life. And once there is no longer life, there will no longer be death. This seems to be a pointing forward, pointing a way forward beyond life and death. So he appears to be of the opinion that death is something apparent, not something actual.
Okay. It sounds like Epicurus then, where once you die, then there's no need.
I mean,
to fear it.
I can give you kind of a range. A range. It seems like we're talking about section 3, right? The end of section 3 and the beginning of section 4.
Okay.
Yeah. Shoot, I
All
really
right.
wish I had the one thing, but I don't. Sorry.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
check that later. Thanks.
We can certainly try and hit back on it next week if you.
Yeah, and if I
plan.
locate, I'll put it in the chat.
Because I think our readings are going to be a bit shorter moving forward, a little bit, yeah. Since we're breaking this last chapter into 3 readings, since it's a bit longer, so we might have a bit more time to unpack some of this stuff.
Yeah, I'd really like to get Stav's perspective on the end of this chapter.
Yeah, and I mean he's certainly going to continue building on these ideas of historicity as we get into this last chapter. So there'll be opportunities certainly. All right, next week we got we're starting our last chapter, Śūnyatā and History, sections 1 through 3, pages 218 through 237. Yeah, wonderful. I'm just gonna plug another book quick. We got Richard Bullitt, The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization. So a nice little, very digestible text, kind of overviewing why it's very valid to include Islam in this schema of like Judeo-Christian or Western to an extent.
So is he speaking historically with that title, or rather than a recommendation for the future?
Both to an extent. He's saying that this was the case historically. These were deeply interdependent and engaged civilizational enterprises, but also it would make sense to use this lens moving forward, rather than separating out Islam as some kind of oppositional category to Judeo-Christian or Christian. Yeah, interesting read.
Can I take a brief tangent before we wrap up?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, I'm sorry Christian's not here, because I think he would probably have something to say to this. Maybe Mackenzie as well. Maybe you guys will. But increasingly, the lens that I'm looking at this through, or everything through, is I've grown increasingly interested in Jung's personality types. And this is something like going back to like 2014, but I'm doing a real deep dive into that right now. And I just began reading his book, Psychological Types, which starts off with just absolutely, it's straight, because, there's a lot of really bad information on the MBTI on the internet. But if you go back and look at the source, it's so above, a lot of this kind of pop culture stuff that you see floating around the internet. He starts off with a discussion of the early church fathers and how his psychological types played out in the formation of the Christian church. So it's super relevant to Corbin. He gets right into Docetism and how it appeals to a particular a particular psychological type. But anyway, I'm reading another book on psychological types where he basically reads it into different philosophical strains, and he contrasts analytic with empirical philosophy, as sort of representative of two different personality types in the philosophical realm. And he uses actually as an example of the exact sort of like continental text that he talks about William James's division into the tough and the tender-minded. So when he uses as an example the sort of tender-minded continental text that a tough-minded empiricist would be impatient with, he uses Whitehead.
Interesting.
Yeah. But it's something that's on my mind a lot in this book. It's definitely in the continental mode. It uses a lot of obscure terminology of his own design that, I go in and out of being able to accept this. There are points at which I think it's definitely it's the only way he can make his argument, and it's an argument worth making. And then there's other points at which I grow impatient with sort of, I'll take 45 minutes to read 2 pages, and I'm not really sure whether those 2 pages said anything.
So you used Whitehead as the tough-minded example?
Yeah, as the tender-minded example.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
But it's a different mode of argumentation, and you kind of got to be willing to enter into it if you want to be able to get anything out of it.
Yeah, I've been considering reading that one as well. I feel like I really should at this point. I used to be super obsessed with MBTI for a long time, and I read a few other of Jung's, but not that one. But it's pretty good.
I'm like embarrassed, that I've been spending as long as I have, sifting through materials on the MBTI, and I never went to the source. It's like that should have been the first thing that I read.
That's how I feel too.
But I honestly, I doubt if 1 out of 10 people in that world have actually read Jung's work on this.
Right. Yeah. What are all our types? Last I've tested pretty consistently.
Wait, Jared. Okay. My girlfriend and I both thought you were INFP, so that was our guesses.
Interesting. I am ENFP.
Okay.
But I'm right on the border between E and I think. So.
I mean, it's so interesting. I really feel. I mean, to the extent that I even buy into the whole schema at all, it's very difficult to type somebody else on the basis of one interaction in one context, right? I only know you from this context, so I have no idea what you are like outside this context.
That's true. Yeah, I tend to have very close friendships with people who are INFP, which I don't know. That's always been pretty consistent for me. So.
I thought it was interesting. So I'm an ambivert. So anytime I take the test, I'm always at like 49% extroverted, 50% introverted. I'm actually ENFP too. So
interesting.
Is there really only 16? Why are we giving it a number? Why are there 16 personalities?
Yeah, Jung has a pretty thorough system, although I tend to think that it's more like they're useful heuristics, and there's always a continuum and context, as Andrew said. Right. But it can be helpful and interesting.
Yeah, when I first got into the big 5 through Peterson, I thought it was really refreshing that it was very much presented as sort of degrees to which you are on this scale for a given trait, rather than, oh, you are an ENFP or something, having these kind of discrete identity categories, which perhaps that wasn't how Jung sort of intended it to be seen as, but that's certainly how it seems to be represented on the internet in the resources you kind of hit on in some Googling.
Yeah, if you go the discrete way, you have to use the cognitive functions, really. But that's much more fundamental. I mean, the psychological types is just 8 different cognitive functions, and then the JP difference wasn't added until like 1945.
Yeah, I like to say that level 1 of the MBTI is learning your own type, right? Level 2 is using it to learn about other people. Level 3 is using it to learn about the cognitive functions, right? How these archetypes work when they're abstracted away from individuals. So yeah, really focusing on the 16 types, and labeling people as different 16 types, to me that's not what it's good for. I've heard it referred to as astrology for people with a 2-year associate's degree.
That's great.
But the point is, even if you don't have patience for that layer of it, there's other layers to it.
When I was first introduced to it, I was actually really frustrated because it was in high school and they wanted me to figure out a career, and I didn't want to figure out a career, and that's the only tool they had to help me.
Yeah.
Remember there was some site, like I think it was Similar Minds. They have a ton of tests that had one of the career options for INTP as assassin, and so I was really happy back then when I was really young. But yeah, I think Andrew and I are both INTP.
I don't know. I'm 14. What do you want from me?
Right. Interesting. INTP. Huh. All right. We're all sharing the NP, I guess then.
It doesn't surprise me that people in a discussion group like this would cluster around certain types.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm a little surprised to hear you're an extrovert. I mean, it makes sense putting together groups like this, but it seems to me anyone spending this amount of time with texts has to have an introverted side.
Sure. Yeah. It's always, I probably fall in that same ambivert category as Alexi. But I don't feel like I'm sort of in between in sort of a kind of tepid state. I feel like I really have some extroverted traits strongly, and I really have some introverted traits strongly as well, where I do have this sort of basic need to have some recharge time away from people, but the like best things I can do with my time is having good interpersonal interactions. That's like very fulfilling for me. So yeah, I don't know, it's interesting to kind of juggle both of those.
Yeah, I like to combine it with the Enneagram as well, which is a whole different system. I think it might have had some Islamic origin, actually. I haven't looked into it.
Interesting. I could believe that. Yeah, certainly there's a robust sort of Sufi psychology and Sufi astrology and all these sorts of things. Like I don't know, I feel like how the modern West has appropriated different religions. It's so much like Buddhism and maybe to an extent some of the kind of paganisms or something, like they have these like profound like psychological systems, but no, we got it in all the traditions here. And I think Evan Thompson made that argument really well in his like Why I'm Not a Buddhist book, where he talks about this idea of Buddhist exceptionalism and how we so often like think of Buddhism as this religion that has all these unique insights that mesh well with like modern science and some of these perspectives. But if you know what you're looking for and you're familiar with the tradition, you can find similarly amenable resources within any religious context, at least within the major world traditions.
Yeah, I thought his discussions or debates with Robert Wright were really good. Robert Wright had the Why Buddhism is True, which is basically going with that new neuroscience perspective that I read.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I think, I mean, they're both obviously operating in very good faith and sort of academically and intellectually robust kind of approaches to these things. So that was a really good debate. Alrighty, my friends, I think we can close out for this evening here. But yeah, this was fun. Always good to see you all. And I look forward to our anti-penultimate discussion next week.
Anti-penultimate. Oh, I've got to use that. Nice.
Yep, thrown in some like GRE words or something.
Yeah, I always felt cool using penultimate, and then you just warmed up to it. So.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, wonderful.
Cool.
Yeah, take care and see you next week.